Hi, good morning. I don't have a long drawn-out monologue for the start of this video. Today, I just want to share my personal experience and review of Suntour suspension. More specifically for that matter, the SR Suntour Aeon 35 fork and the Suntour Tri-Air 23CR shock come spec'd stock on my borrowed Polygon Siskiyou T7E. We're doing this test at White Rock Recreational Area in Hillsborough, New Brunswick. These trails have been featured on the channel a bunch. As a matter of fact, we were literally here a few days ago. Let's now discuss, purely based on memory, my first ride impressions after the initial setup, taking this thing out for the first time ever with this fork and this shock. So I did my normal thing. I set this up at like 25-ish% sag, whatever pressure that ended up being. I used the O-ring here. Same thing with the front, about 25% sag or so, maybe a little bit more, maybe. And on that first ride, I remember being very taken aback at just how deep the suspension felt like it was like initially riding in. Like this thing at initial setup at 25% sag felt like if I screwed up setting up my other red steel full suspension and like accidentally set it at like 50%. Like it felt that deep. I was like, how could I possibly have screwed this up so badly? And actually, I think it still kind of feels like that. I don't really know what it is. I guess it maybe is just like really sensitive initial stroke, maybe. Not something that it's just not something I'm used to. Typically all my bikes are like really just rough. They're rough bikes. This thing is not rough, but I was absolutely not used to it. And I had actually checked it a bunch of times to be like, did I mess this up? Like, is air coming out of this? And it was fine. And if I'm honest, initially I sort of hated it. But as I've been taking this thing on stuff like this more, I'm really starting to like that like initial bit deeper feeling in the suspension type of, I don't know, performance, I guess. Instead of the bike feeling like it wants to like bounce and ping around and just go on a different direction than what I'm trying to tell it to, it feels like this thing's just trying to stay on the ground and work with me. Which is good when you're trying not to die. Not so good when you're trying to like bunny hop stuff. It's just kind of cool to experience what like pro mountain bike reviewers usually are talking about when it comes to suspension and the way it works. Admittedly though, I didn't really love it at first because it's such a far departure from my normal setup. It just felt so soft for the sag and the air pressure that I had in it that it just felt like it wasn't supportive enough. And for the first few rides, I was just sort of expecting it to like blow through the travel a bunch and just basically start breaking stuff, which would have been a real bummer. But actually, I've never blown the O-ring off the end of this unless the bottom out is before blowing off the O-ring. This, I guess I have, but it's never felt super harsh. It does have to be said, this setup on this bike has opened my eyes to the idea of running a bit of a setup that offers more traction than just something for jumping on dirt jumps. Under the correct circumstances, that is. There's different use cases, different times, call for different things. But you know, when you're not hitting jumps, maybe it's kind of nice to have some suspension that wants to keep the wheels on the ground and offer traction. Real sweet. There is a really glaring, such a glaring fault with this fork though. It seems like in any temperature below 10 degrees Celsius, it just goes rock solid. It just doesn't work. No matter what you do with the settings, no matter what you do with the rebound, I even took some air out, the fork basically goes rigid. So for the first few runs, it was working pretty great. And then it's been out in the cold for a little bit and it just kind of does nothing. Like it just kind of stays completely solid all the way up there. It just is not performing as a suspension fork at all. Only ever experienced this with Suntour forks. Every other fork, like it can be minus 12 and it'll still work pretty good. Once it like gets moving, fork oil heats up, whatever's in it heats up and it works as intended. This in like the slightest bit of like fall temperatures, it's like 8 degrees right now and it's just not working. And it wasn't working yesterday either. At the end of the ride, riding home, it was just rock solid rigid. It's almost like there's a fork lockout that's like turned on, but this doesn't have a lockout and the compression is all the way open. There's no compression dampening on. I know other forks are affected by the cold, but other forks don't become completely useless. This currently, as it sits, is kind of useless. But the rear shock's, it's okay. It's just more than a little off-putting when the rear suspension stays so active and the front becomes rigid. Over these roots, I can feel the fork deflecting instead of actually just working as suspension. It's just flexing.
Anyway, I think you get the idea. Initially a little skeptical. I've learned to kind of like the way the bike feels planted and just kind of keeps you on the ground. It's a really confidence-inspiring ride that just completely falls apart in cold temperatures. So if I lived in a warmer climate that didn't affect the performance, I could be like, this is, you gotta really look at this Suntour suspension because it's a lot less expensive than all the other stuff. It's some of the better feeling suspension that I've used. But when it becomes a really rigid, heavy fork in the cold, ugh. Anyway, I had mentioned the change in performance problem when we rode this bike in the snow. Some people said, hey, maybe try changing the oil. Maybe that's the problem. I'm definitely willing to try that, but I also understand that that's like something that's outside of a lot of people's skill, tools available. Like they don't really want to spend the money to go like bring it to a shop to have it it's an extra thing you have to do, so it's very much worth bringing up, I think. Okay, that's the conclusion of this video. I'm going back to headed back to Nova Scotia like right now. We'll see you there.